Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here in Prince George at the 17th Annual Natural Resources Forum. Been here many times, and it's always a very good few days. It's my pleasure to moderate this morning's panel, A Collective Vision for BC's Mining Sector. Before I go further, I want to recognize that we stand on the traditional territories of the Teneese First Nation. We're grateful to be here. I'd also like to thank Seabridge Gold for sponsoring our panel, and I want to thank our panelists for being here today. And I don't know if the camera can get a close-up, but I'm wearing a Mining for Miracles pin. And it's an annual fundraiser that the mining industry does. We all come together in support of BC's Children's Hospital, which provides fantastic care for children all across our province. And today's our kickoff day. Thank you. So the Premier Horgan is upstairs, and they were doing the official kickoff, probably doing it right now. So that's fantastic. And the Mining Association, or the mining industry in BC, has contributed over $30 million to BC Children's in the last 30 years. So we're very proud of that. I'm looking forward to what our panelists have to say this morning and the discussion that I hope will ensue. And I'll introduce them in just a moment. But some context, when we talk of a collective vision for mining on this panel, it is within the critical context of our sector's relations with Indigenous peoples, namely reconciliation, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and of course, the BC government's legislation, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Of course, the Declaration and reconciliation go well beyond mining. It's a subject of great import to all British Columbians and to future generations, and it transcends politics. For many, the Declaration is a defining moment on the path towards social justice for Indigenous peoples. For others, the Declaration, particularly FPIC, is a potential challenge to resource development. Having said that, BC's mining sector, for some time, has taken a leadership position in advancing economic reconciliation with BC's Indigenous peoples through numerous agreements, partnerships, and collaborative ventures that reflect the principles found in the Declaration. At the Mining Association of BC, we're optimistic that the Declaration will advance meaningful reconciliation, enable greater certainty on the land, and be a rising tide to lift all boats. That's not to say it's going to be easy. The headlines reflect that. But it's incumbent on all of us to push through and make it work. The truth is, the status quo wasn't exactly engendering confidence in BC's economic future. From the beginning, mining has been foundational to British Columbia. It helped build our province, and it defined who we are. Miners were some of the earliest settlers to see the potential in what would become British Columbia. They were optimists, entrepreneurs, and innovators, and they remain so today. But we know that in the past, the Indigenous communities on whose lands our mines are located did not have a say in the location, development, operation, or benefits of the mines. Yet today, Indigenous communities are sharing in the benefits of mining through innovative impact benefit agreements with our members. Many Indigenous communities are sharing directly in mineral tax revenue for mines operating in their traditional territories. And our members in government are funding joint technical review committees with our Indigenous partners. We're proud that mining is the largest private sector employer of Indigenous people across Canada. And here in BC at the Brucejack and Red Chris mines, for example, approximately 30% of the mine's workforce come from the Tahltan Nation. And mining is also a major partner with Indigenous businesses. Last year, BC's 17 mines and 2 smelters purchased over $250 million worth of goods, materials, and services from 120 Indigenous affiliated businesses. Fundamental to all of this is the need to work together, to move from uncertainty and conflict towards shared understanding, cooperation, collaboration, and partnership. That's in part what the Declaration is seeking to achieve. Now I'll introduce our panel with that context. Please hold your applause while I briefly read their bios, and then we'll begin. Our first panelist, on your right, on my left, is Kathryn Teneese, the Nation Chair of the Ktunaxa Nation Council. Kathryn is the Ktunaxa Nation Chair as well as Chief Negotiator for their ongoing treaty negotiations with British Columbia and Canada. Kathryn has been very active in public service. Her recent service includes being a member of the First Nations Summit Task Group, serving as the Chair of the New Relation Trust, and more recently, as a member of the provincial government's Climate Solutions and Clean Growth Advisory Council. To Kathryn's left is Heather Lawrence, our second panelist. Heather is the Global Manager of Indigenous Affairs for Teck Resources. And at Teck, Heather has corporate responsibility for the company's relationships with Indigenous communities globally, including implementing Teck's Indigenous Peoples Policy and oversight of the company's agreement-making process with Indigenous communities. Heather came to Teck after a successful career with the federal government, bringing 20 years of experience negotiating modern-day treaties. Our third speaker on the panel is Chief John Allen French of the Takla Nation. Chief French was recently re-elected to his second 4-year term as Chief of the Takla Nation. He is also hereditary Chief of the Takla. Before entering politics, Chief French was a successful businessman in the forest industry with multiple employees and contracts. He sought to employ people from his own territory and use sustainable practices to minimize impacts on the land. During his previous tenure as Chief, Deputy Chief, Councillor, and in his current position, Chief French uses his business background and traditional knowledge to advance the people of the Takla Nation in their negotiations with government and industry. And our fourth panelist is Ben Wither, Manager of HSEC and People at the Red Chris Mine, which is now majority owned by Newcrest Mining. And for those that may not be aware, Newcrest is an Australian-based mining company and one of the world's largest gold miners with a very strong track record in sustainable mining. We're pleased to have them in British Columbia, having acquired a 70% interest in Red Chris. Ben leads and ensures the safe, efficient, and cost-effective oversight of the people, health, safety, environment, and community groups at the Red Chris mine. Prior to joining Newcrest, Ben was an environmental consultant in Perth, Australia, specializing in risk management, audit, monitoring, closure planning, and compliance. Ben also brings 12 years of experience working with Barrick Gold in both Australia and Chile. Would you please join me in welcoming our panelists? So we'll start our panel. Each panelist will make opening remarks of some 7 minutes. And after each panelist has presented, we'll open the floor to questions with Pigeonhole, and I hope spark some discussion. And if time permits, we'll have a very brief closing remarks.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the homeland of the Teneese people where we are gathered and thank them for the opportunity to do our business on their homeland. So when I was asked to do this panel, I was thinking about it and realizing that while it has become sort of a current event in most people's lives, it's been something that's been involved, that we have been dealing with since it was passed in 2007. So it's important for the participants here to remember that was 13 years ago, and that many of the principles of the UN Declaration have been held and articulated by Indigenous peoples for generations before that. It's also important to note that the UN Declaration is fundamentally about human rights and provides an opportunity to work together to change the current narrative in this country that has been based on a flawed, imbalanced relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. This is an enormous undertaking that will not be quick or easy and will require commitment and endurance from all involved. It seems it's well overdue that convergence is occurring where non-Indigenous governments are becoming more aligned to having the kinds of conversations that Indigenous governments have been waiting to have for many, many years. So I'm going to talk a bit about our frame and what this opportunity provides. And given that we're talking about the mining industry, I'm talking about it from a broad perspective, but then we can also apply what I'm sharing with you to mining. The UN Declaration gives non-Indigenous governments and companies an opportunity to examine and reveal their assumptions and to acknowledge that the lens that they have typically viewed the world and their objectives must become different in order to fully express the principles of the UN Declaration. For example, the description I received about this panel were, the intent of the workshop is to have open and honest dialogue on mining and Indigenous involvement in the sector, the positives and the not so positives, and how it looks through the lens of the Declaration. So let's talk about that phrase, involvement in the sector. Here's where we can identify our frame of reference. It already assumes an existing sector and how Indigenous peoples can participate in something that already is the mining sector. If we were to look at the second part of the session's objectives, how it looks through the lens of the Declaration, we can widen our frame and also ask questions like, how can the mining sector participate in processes that support the ability of Indigenous peoples to participate in decision-making in accordance with their procedures, that's Article 18, in order for states to obtain Indigenous peoples' free, prior, informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them, Article 8. In the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources, Article 29. And the last question would be, in ensuring that Indigenous peoples are justly, fairly, equitably compensated for the lands and resources which have been taken, used, damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent, Article 10. And participate in the improvement of their economic and social conditions, Article 21. It is also important to ask ourselves what we mean by consent. Consent may mean different things to Indigenous people than it means to industry and governments. Does it mean permission? What responsibilities come with that? What happens if consent is not given? So I'll just talk now a little bit about our experience as the Ktunaxa Nation, some of the positives and not so positives. In response to the second part of the purpose of the workshop session, the ups and downs of working with the mining sector, we have experience with both. On the positive side, it has allowed us to grow our own institutions and to build our internal decision-making processes. This, along with citizen engagement, have been processes that we have built in order to have the conversation amongst ourselves. Mining forces us to ask ourselves important questions that only we can answer. By being recognized as title holders, we are now receiving recognition of title impacts and other governments and industry are starting to pay rent for the use of our lands. Government to government working towards shared decision-making with respect to mining in our territory. And finally, we've been able to work towards developing partnerships with industry and informing their management practices. On the challenging side, industrial mining has been occurring in Ktunaxa, our homeland, for over 100 years, and only recently have we become involved. There has already been a lot of damage done within certain parts of the territory to all living things without our free, prior, and informed consent. In those areas, we're not sure that we're ever going to be Ktunaxa on that part of our territory again. Maintaining the balance, which translates to our people care for the land and the land care for the people. So that's sort of from a very high level, where we're looking at the recent passage of Bill 41. But I want to say that while it sounds like it's hugely challenging, I think that we also have an opportunity. We should look at this as an opportunity to begin to move this country to a different place in our relationship between and amongst ourselves, so that we can indeed stand up and be proud of the record that we have in terms of our relationship amongst Canadians. But it means a huge shift on the part of others. We know from an Indigenous perspective, we know what it is, and we're prepared to help. So we're not saying that this is the end. In fact, this is the beginning, and we look forward to working together with all of our partners, and in our case, in particular, with the folks that are doing mining in our homeland, to working towards something that is going to be reflective of a true partnership and having some sort of equity between those involved. So I'll leave my comments at that, Mr. Moderator, and pass it on.
Thank you, Kathryn. Heather?
All right. Thank you, Michael. And I would like to start by acknowledging that we're within the traditional territories of the Takla First Nation, and to thank them for allowing us to meet here today. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to be on this panel today, focused on the mining industry and how we can work in partnership with Indigenous communities. And I'm certainly humbled to be on this panel with Kathryn, Teneese, and Chief John French. It's a great pleasure. So my name is Heather Lawrence. I am the Manager of Indigenous Affairs for Teck Resources. So Teck is Canada's largest diversified mining company. We have significant operations here in British Columbia, a large copper mine, a series of metallurgical coal mines within Ktunaxa territory. We have a zinc smelter as well in BC. We also have significant operations elsewhere in North America and South America. And as I say, I have responsibility from a corporate perspective for Teck's work with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. I am not an Indigenous person, and I see my role within Teck as a responsibility primarily to listen to Indigenous peoples in order to understand what's important, what the concerns are, what the priorities are, and also to listen to the folks within my company, to listen to the general managers who have responsibility for operating mines around the world, within the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, to listen to senior vice presidents who have responsibilities for running business units, and to listen to the regulatory technicians within our company who are working so hard to get our activities permitted so we can continue to operate. And that really my role is to facilitate useful dialogue in order to figure out how we can all work together in a good way. So in my opening remarks, I'm going to share 3 messages today. And my first message, I'm going to echo something we've already heard from Kathryn, which is to really encourage everyone to see the opportunity that's in front of us right now. Primarily, I see it as an opportunity to continue the work towards reconciliation in British Columbia, but also more broadly across Canada. As government, as industry, as First Nation communities, we have been responding to the evolving interpretation of Indigenous rights for a long time. Some of us really leading the charge, and I want to acknowledge the good work that has been done by so many Indigenous communities, particularly in BC, who have been working so hard in the area of furthering Indigenous rights. And I really see the Declaration Act as one more step along this path, and it is a significant step. So I really do want to encourage everyone to seize this opportunity to support economic reconciliation and to work with Indigenous communities to support their participation in the Canadian economy in ways that they choose to do. My second message is that we all can and should play a role. I don't think that this is about, and by this I mean the Declaration Act here in British Columbia, I don't think it's about government giving us a playbook, even though I do think there are, that would make possibly people's lives easier. I actually don't think that that's the right way to set everybody up for success. As industry, our interest is in continuing to conduct our business. And I think the best way to ensure that we can is by engaging effectively with government and having shared dialogue with Indigenous communities. So in terms of that role for industry, we do have the opportunity to share our thoughts, our concerns about how to implement the Declaration Act in a good way, and work through some of those very practical, on-the-ground level considerations. And in terms of engaging a little bit more broadly, we can also be engaging at a couple of levels. So at that, I want to say higher level in terms of advocating with government, working through industry organizations, working with the BCAFN about how the framework is going to be implemented broadly. But I also think just as importantly is the opportunity for direct engagement with the Indigenous communities who are our closest relationships, whose traditional territories we're carrying out our activities within. I think it's going to be critically important to understand what implementation means within those specific contexts of the relationships and the activities that are happening on the ground. And by working together and everybody playing a role, we can support implementation of the Declaration Act that works in a good way for everyone. The third message that I would like to share today is to really encourage people to not be afraid and to not resist the changes that are coming. There's no question that there is some uncertainty now. The act has been passed, the framework is out there, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of supporting implementation. And from an industry perspective, we don't like uncertainty very much. I think it's fair to say from a human being perspective, we don't like uncertainty very much, but I would certainly encourage everyone to recognize that very normal reaction to the uncertainty, do our best to set that aside, and really to choose to act. Whether it's figuring out the details of shared decision-making or how to work together to achieve free, prior, and informed consent, or what it means to implement any of the individual articles within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I think we all have a shared interest in figuring this out together. Thanks.
Thank you. Chief French.
Thank you, Michael, speakers. Good morning to everyone, ladies, gentlemen, hereditary chiefs, leaders, elders. I'd like to address the lately Teneese for me to be able to speak on their land in my own language. I'd like to come at my experiences, I guess, from a little different, maybe more grassroots perspective for understanding. We have a dynamic group here that's touching on a lot of things, and maybe it'd be important to understand what actually takes place. I come from a community in Takla Nation that's very isolated. We're right central BC. We've been involved with mining, the mining, the asphalt that goes through our territory has very high concentration of gold and copper, and so we've been involved since the 30s. Early miners have been coming through, a large influx in the 60s, and we've been both negatively impacted, and there probably was some level of employment and different things. However, the social negative impacts on our people have been going on for 150 years, and mining has been one of them that has impacted my community as well. The other is forestry. So from my perspective, I was raised by my grandparents. I somehow missed out the era of residential schools. I was able to stay in the community, out on the land, and provide and caretake for my grandparents, who brought a lot of traditional and cultural knowledge into my hereditary name in my training. I started with a young name at 11, and then later on graduated, if you will, into the name Goehring, which is a much larger responsibility in that process. I was made to sit in potlatches and ceremonies from the time I could remember. And this was sometimes not so pleasant, as some of my friends were outside playing. I was made to sit there. However, today I do appreciate the knowledge that I have when it comes down to my people and the understanding of their relationship to the land, the medicines, and the different resource that is there on a different level than the resource that may be what the world is looking at. We have other values, and our relationship is very tied to the land. We go into the mountains every summer and do our gatherings. For my people, which I think I'll come from that perspective, and I'll get to why, of talking about my people in Takla, we do live off of groundhogs, caribou, and that time out there on the land in the summers, within our movements, our relationship, our spiritual and cultural values that we practice out there are very, very important to us. It's something that is probably not understood. I can't imagine or expect anyone that hasn't raised with that to understand that. And that's probably some of the most important piece that you need to give some respect to. As I raised out there, for example, places that my grandmother's ancestors went, walked, markings, spiritual sites, and places that has been a part of their history forever, is changed through industry and what it's trying to achieve by coming in and with gold mines and different things like that. That is a direct impact to our spiritual being. That is a direct impact to our being. However, I've also been an industry person, and I was probably at the age of about 19, 20, I started getting involved in logging. From there, I've moved into exploration and other things like that. So I've stood back many times looking at these different dynamics, my people's culture and values, the things that are important to them and the things that hurt them that the world doesn't understand yet. The way the colonization happened and affected us, continued to carry on. I also looked at the industry perspective, the employment and that shift, maybe, if you will, as a people. What can we do? How can we balance both worlds? And that definitely was a challenge. But I did that successfully for quite a few years. Then I decided to go into leadership at one point in time. I don't know if I decided that or was kind of shoved into it a bit, but there I was. One of my first dealings was to deal with Northgate Minerals and Ktunaxa North, which we just won the Headley Award for last week or the week before in Vancouver for environment and social, which is an interesting thing. That brought a lot of perspective for me to get to know the people more and to work through some processes. And this was a large project that Northgate was putting forward to build a tailings pond out of an existing lake of 21 kilometers of lakeshore, a very large lake and an important lake to the Sekani people, which is one part of our ancestries in Takla. And the people had said no right off the get-go. It was quite clear that this wasn't to be negotiated. Our people made a stance and said that this project will not go forward and we will not accept ever using lakes for tailing ponds within our territory. Furthermore, how could BC or Canada even contemplate such things with the danger of where does it end? So we went into this battle, and at the time Northgate Minerals left that as the only option. If that wasn't the option, there is no mine. So we went through that process. We continuously said we understand economy, we understand all these other things that people need in life, and we asked them to redraw their design and take the lake out and look at things like underground. That wasn't an option, so we went through an EA process. People got together and we started going through a process. We had to make a decision whether we'd even join the EA process or boycott it, because at the time there was never any examples of an EA process actually making recommendations or decisions based on First Nation concerns. So it seems that the odds were against us pretty good. However, we decided to go through this process, and through that process, we got our message across very strong. At the end of the day, the decision was granted in our favor that the lake was to never be used. Interestingly enough, I was the spokesperson for the Teck at that time, which is 3 communities that came together with a shared interest in the area. So I experienced that after the decisions had been made. The same players had gone away very upset with this fractured relationship, and the attitude was you could never ever do business in BC mining. You know, it was this really harsh sort of message and leave. However, not quite a year goes by. One of the main players throughout the negotiation got a hold of me and said, well, John, you know, we have a different design here. We're wondering if you want to come look at it. Just happened so that I was no longer chief, and I said, well, you know, maybe I'm not the right guy. He said, no, we know you're the right guy because of the experiences that were there, so if you can help us with this. So I found that very interesting. I thought, well, there's probably some interesting aspect to all that to make something work positively for both sides. So I went to work on that, and I actually went to work for the mine, and over 2 or 3 year period, we actually have an IBA and an agreement today. And that was where the award came from. It was a long process, and you know, we actually worked through something that people thought was impossible and would never happen, and I think that agreement is sitting there and is going to be very beneficial for both parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Ben?
All right, so first off, just like to say that Newcrest, we're quite proud to be joining BC Mining. We've been circling this area for quite a while, and we've got the opportunity to come in here. So we acknowledge that we're working on our traditional First Nations. For Red Chris, it's Tahltan, and here it's the Takla Nation. So Newcrest, who are we? So we're a mining company from Australia. We've got operations in New South Wales, Western Australia, operation in Indonesia. We've got a large project in Papua New Guinea and a concept project in Papua New Guinea as well called Wafi. We're quite lucky in that our projects are quite long life. They've all got quite long reserves, which allows us the opportunity to establish some long-lasting relationships with our host communities and host nations. So that's one plus for us. In terms of a business, we do what we say. We're very committed to our values. We work very hard with our local host groups around understanding what their concerns are when we go through the design and concept of various projects. We generally grow through organic growth, so we do some mergers and acquisitions, but mainly we expand our existing operations. So a lot of expansion of the Cadia operation. We're currently expanding Telfer, and Red Chris is another great example of us looking for huge growth potential of that operation. Just been through that bit. So yeah, for Red Chris, one of the things we're looking at now is really expanding on the existing reserve and resource there and to try and turn it into a true Tier 1 operation. And that's applying a lot of our edge factors around how to optimise the processing plan, optimise the mining sequence, look at our supply chain, and more importantly, look at a close community supply chain, and expanding our resource through exploration project. Again, that's done through joint ventures with our local host nations as well. And then for future is all around the block caving potential, which is something we specialise in as a business. It brings us a lot of opportunity to access resources with a lower impact, which is an important part for the host nation as well. We will be able to minimise the amount of waste material being brought to surface and access the reserves that are there. So as a business, I think one of our focuses is all around that every person that works at our mines go home safe and healthy every day. We have a program we call New Safe, which is one of our pillars on our safety transformation program. It's all around understanding and people making the right choice when they're at work so they get to go home safe to their families and why we go to work every day. We make a conscious effort to care for the environment, cultural heritage and our social performance. And we do that through a strong and respectful relationship with our host nations and our broader communities and decision makers. And one thing we always ask of our host communities is around holding us accountable to delivering against what we say we're going to do. So like everyone here, we're always members of various industry bodies, but I guess the big thing for us is we joined ICMM late last 2018, and it really helps us hold ourselves accountable to some greater industry standards as well, and also learn from our peers. So that's been a good journey for us. Case study for us at Telfer Mine's been going for some 40 years. It's been through a few different owners. And through that process, we've established a really strong relationship with the Martu people, which is the local traditional owners there. And it's been all around capability building and a sustainable, long-term sustained relationship. And some of the focus areas has been around Indigenous training and employment, health programs. So we do a lot of non-mine site related activities within the broader community on health. Educational support, lots of sponsorship programs for the kids to go and get higher education, community capacity building programs, and we get involved in a lot of the community activities as well, so some of the races and a few different things, which is a lot of fun. But for me, when I worked at Telfer, one of our biggest sort of accomplishments was the high developmental throughput. So we had some 500 employees, which were local hires, and they've all gone on to have transferable skill sets which they can take to different mines. And then finally, Red Chris, where are we going with that, and what do we see going forward? I think for us it's been great when we joined the mine. We spent some time with the First Nation and the chiefs of the area to really understand their concerns. That was part of the process before we went through the final acquisition. It helped us kind of understand the challenges we've got coming forward, and we think with an open and respectful relationship between us and them, we'll get a long, sustainable outcome, and Red Chris will be what it truly should be as a Tier 1 asset. So yeah. Nice.
Thank you, Ben.
So we have more questions.
Okay, thank you, panelists. We will now go into questions on Pigeonhole. I'm just going to riff off you first, though, Ben, and I'm curious, as someone who comes from Australia and has been doing business in the mining sector in Australia, can you reflect on the differences or similarities that you see in BC mining with respect to industry collaboration with Indigenous peoples?
Yep. So I guess one of my longest lasting memories is when I was an environmental graduate at one of the mines, and we did some work with one of the local Indigenous groups, and it was all around their concern to protect the environment and protect the land. So then fast forward 30 years, and when I arrived in Vancouver, we sat down with TCG representatives, and it was very clear, and it was a good understanding that they were a key decision maker. They're not just a stakeholder; they're a decision maker in the process. So, for me, that's been probably the biggest turning point, is understanding and appreciating that process, which allows us to plan for it and ensure that we have that timely engagement early on in the piece before we get stuck down a certain path and feel like we're getting railroaded into a different direction. From a First Nation perspective, so we make sure that they're involved in those designs, the concepts, so we can walk through that process. So I guess it gives us a nice, strong framework to work with.
Right. And I would imagine, there's working with the Tahltan, you've got IBAs with Red Chris, and there's a level of certainty there. You have to abide by your agreements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Work cooperatively with them.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at Pigeonhole, there's a few questions on consent. No surprise. I'd just like to start with this. I think this is an interesting question with the 8 votes from Robin Sidney Smith. If asking, does consent equal a veto, are we asking the wrong question? Is a better question, how do we earn consent? What do we need to do to keep talking until we do get to yes? Any takers? Kathryn? Chief?
Well, I'll start off by saying that we do agree that the word veto isn't used, but it was really interesting that when we first began the conversation about the UN declaration, that was the first thing that jumped out. Everybody's saying, okay, now the First Nations have a veto, and all of these things from a negative perspective. And it seems to me that, rather than looking at it through the lens of negativity, that why can't we just look at something that is the right thing to do? In fact, that's what this is about. This is about shifting the landscape to a place where Indigenous people are being treated the way that they should be as as people in their homelands who have the ability to make decisions about what takes place on those homelands. And my question would be, why wouldn't a mining company want to proceed without consent? What would it say about that company if they weren't exploring how it could proceed without consent? What communities need to understand is that the free, prior, and informed consent means to Indigenous communities, and also to realize that we're talking about something more than another procedural step in consultation. It's a fundamental reworking of what we mean in decision-making power and authority, and we do need to find ways to work together to get to that place of consent. Because to me, it's examining why isn't that consent being provided? What's the barrier? And if you can find ways to deal with those barriers and be open to having that conversation and realizing that some of these things are going to take time, but as you build the relationship, that time will decrease as the level of understanding and trust develops between and amongst the parties that are involved in the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Chief French, would you like to have a go at that?
Yes. So, no, the answer is no. It's not a veto, in my opinion. I think society fails to recognize First Nation bands, organizations, groups as a decision-making body. We're decision makers. My nation, we have a lot of complicity that we're trying to work through. However, we focus on a nation, and we are demonstrating our governance decision-making power, our authority. We're demonstrating those types of things on our lands, and we need to be viewed as very important as a decision-making body that is at a government-to-government level. I think when society fails to realize that, we try a bunch of other tactics to get through it, and we end up back at the same place, which is not a good one. Mm-hmm. It is not a veto, in my opinion.
Okay. Ben?
I just wanted to read out, I think also the bit about it's not a transactional once-off, it's an ongoing relationship between the parties. So I think that's a key thing too. And that may be a correlation back to Australia, is that in the past that was a transactional thing. You got your land access agreements and then off you went to the races. Now it's all around having an ongoing engagement process that is continual through each phase of a mine.
So you move from transactional to relationship-based arrangements. Chief, I have to ask you, interesting story you told. What was it that changed the dynamic that enabled you to engage and get that IBA?
Full participation and respect. One of the biggest failures is First Nations deal with, on a continuous basis, someone else bringing in a design on what it should look like. Constantly we're having to deal with that, whether it's from an INAC or another company or another organization. It's drawn up, you come in, and this is what we're going to do, what do you think? It's really the wrong approach. You've got to get involved with the nations as leaders and right down to the grassroots people early up front. And take a great interest in their values. What are the values? Each nation, each group's going to have a different system, a different structure. And, you know, the sooner you get to know them, the sooner you take them serious, the sooner you start to understand, it's going to start to create this dialogue in a respectful manner. And you'll start to get through figuring it out together. So you have to design the process together. So when you come to a negotiating table, I hope you bring a blank piece of paper.
This is what I'm hearing is this is a two-way communication process. Right?
It is,
Yeah.
and I have to thank
Asking for your input, and I'm willing to make changes. We're going to do this together. This is joint decision making.
Yes, I think once that's identified, that trust is built, and that you know, you have to understand First Nations have this trust that has been broken for a long time too. So when you come into that, we need to be respectful of all those things. That we have to do a light introduction and gain some trust before we can start any process.
Thank you.
Can I say
Yes, Heather,
something
you
about FPIC? And I sort of asked for the opportunity to comment on this one because it is such a critical issue in terms of respectful work with Indigenous communities. So at Teck, there was a reference to it earlier. We have an Indigenous peoples policy that governs our work with Indigenous peoples. And as part of that policy, we have a stated commitment to work to achieve free, prior, and informed consent. And we have those additional words to describe our efforts because all the commitment we can make is to work to achieve free, prior, and consent. It's up to the Indigenous community to give it or not give it. And that adopting that commitment means that FPIC is a piece that's included in our early due diligence. So because we recognize that, you know, very much to the point Kathryn made, we are not interested in conducting our business within the traditional territory of an Indigenous community who doesn't want us to be there. You know, why would we want to do that? And it should be part of our early stage due diligence. It's like, you know, is there a resource there? Do the Indigenous communities want us to be there? You know, it's fundamental to being successful. And it is complex. There's no question it's complex. You know, I think about Teck's relationship with the Ktunaxa. There's no way we could move forward without the support and the consent of the Ktunaxa. We are carrying out our activities within their traditional territory, and they are the single community, Indigenous community within that traditional territory. In other areas where we operate, we're within overlapping territories. And then it does get more complicated. You know, a number of the questions about the veto piece, that if there's one community who is not supportive, does not give their consent, you know, what happens? And I do think that's a live question, and it's a challenging question, and it's very much, I think, specific to the unique circumstances of the situation. And, you know, very much to Ben's comment, it's an ongoing process. So even if you have consent today, you need to continue to work to ensure the good working relationship continues. And if you don't have consent, there's nothing that says you can't keep trying to secure consent. That, you know, by making changes and working in partnership and having that open dialogue, that there might be the possibility of finding a way to move forward together in a good way with the project.
Thank you, Heather. So we have time for one more question. And there is a question on Pigeonhole that has the most votes. And the question is for you, Chief French. You knew this was coming.
I knew this was coming. And if I had the answer, maybe this wouldn't be going on. I think it's there's a few parts here. For one, I believe government needs to do more title work. I believe government hangs on to the title piece and probably for control and that piece, and that might even be human nature. However, we've never surrendered our rights. We've never surrendered title here in BC, and our people are going to continue to demonstrate that. As far as the company goes, I don't know how we got here. I wasn't involved in it. I asked the question is why weren't the concerns taken more seriously up front? I know a large group of First Nations agree to the pipeline and the process, but I would have contemplated why couldn't we have moved it or went around or do some things like that. I really don't have an answer to that. I feel it's an unfortunate one where maybe the boat's already sailed, and I hope we don't go backwards here as a people, as a government, as First Nations, forcefully imposing things on people when they've strongly demonstrated that. However, you have to be involved in these things from the front. Every group of our First Nations people are going to have a different position on it. And simply, government needs to do more title work with First Nations people. That is the ultimate message that I can bring. I also appreciate on the same token that they have moved the dial, right? We are making progress. We are here. We're talking. People are listening, trying to understand. It's come a long ways. I'm grateful and appreciative of that. However, in some ways, it's also just the beginning. So,
Still lots of work to do.
there is a lot of work to do.
I'm really grateful that these panelists have taken the time out of their busy lives to come be with us here today. We have just under 5 minutes to end this panel. I just want to give each of them an opportunity to take 45 seconds or so to conclude and make a last remark, and then we'll call it a day on this mining panel. Kathryn?
Thank you, Michael. I guess my challenge to you would be to familiarize yourself with the UN Declaration and look at it for what it is. It is a human rights instrument, and it shouldn't be treated as a risk. It should be treated as an opportunity. I think for far too long, Indigenous people in this province and in this country and in this world have been treated as a risk to be managed. And that's not what we are. So I challenge you to familiarize yourselves with this instrument that is going to be something that is going to help us move forward as a collective. And it's an opportunity, and I hope that you will all look at it that way. And answer to that last question, I think that there are articles within the Declaration that can help move some of the conversation forward on many fronts. So that's my challenge to all of you in the audience.
Thank you. Heather?
I hardly know where to begin, but I actually think it's more important to hear from Kathryn and from the chief, so I'll keep my remarks very brief. I really think that there's potential that mining can be good. It can contribute to the economy. It contributes to our quality of life, and that together we have the opportunity to figure out how to do mining in a good way. And I think that would be my closing comment.
Thank you very much. Chief French?
I'd like to encourage companies and governments to continue their work with First Nations, start that early dialogue, get to that place of understanding. At the end of the day, First Nations need good projects. We have many social issues, educational issues. We have tons and tons of social issues that have arrived from colonization, and we all know that story. However, some of these projects can help. Some of these projects can help us, and in some way what I find ourselves dealing with is we take whatever we gain and we put it back into healing our history. We take whatever we gain and we put it back into our own values, and we're trying to reconcile with our own people in so many ways. So first and foremost, these projects can be helpful, they can be meaningful. Our people do need employment. Our values and spiritual, the aspects of our lives, our stewardship responsibilities are all a part of that. And just get into the communities and be respectful, deal with them. You will get through it. You will find a way through to come to a respectful place. I can't encourage that enough. Get into that process early up front and take people serious.
Thank you, Chief. Ben?
I'll be brief. I guess the couple of key things is don't go to the table with assumptions. So we have to be conscious of the language we use internally as a business. Often we will go talk about concept studies, and we've got to make sure that people don't get to be perceived to have a decision already made. So we're spending a lot of time walking through how we stage gate projects, but again, it's to rock up to the table with ideas on how we want to access that resource sustainably with a long-lasting future. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, and please join me in thanking our panel.